I'll be talking about a reception of Medea from Brazil called Alem Do Rio. So, this play was by Agostinho Olavo and it was believed to be published around 1961. I'm going to talk a bit about the history and cultural context of Brazil during the 1960s. I'll hit the storyline and we'll talk about similarities and differences between Medea and Alem do Rio. We'll talk about themes of Alem do Rio and also we'll talk about the reception of how Olavo intended it to represent the struggle of Afro Brazilians at the time. So, firstly, some of the background on this play. Alem do Rio, which is an adaptation of Medea, is part of a set of plays produced by the Black Experimental Theater in 1944 by the playwright Nascimento. So, while Olavo was not an Afro descendant, he empathized with their cause and really wanted to show how Brazil had not let go of the racial power and hierarchy that still dominates a lot of Brazil's social sectors. So Olavo really wanted to portray Medea as a black queen in order to highlight displacement that black Brazilians felt. So at this time, African traditions were not given the same respect as Portuguese traditions, and this shows very clearly within his play. At this time, Brazil was also under dictatorship starting in 1964, and the new military government really censored the arts. So, by choosing to focus on the classical past of this play, Medea, Olavo was able to express current issues such as like Latin American political instability within Brazil, and he was able to critique this unstable government without drawing too much attention to censorship agencies. And then within Brazil, despite race relations being different than the US, for example, intermarriage was common, and then also race based policies weren't as strong as the US, people still knew that there was not a racial democracy, right? Black Brazilians were treated much poorer than white Brazilians and had held less positions of power. So within this play, we have Jinga, who's an African queen. She's Medea. We have Jasau, who's like Jason. And we have Cruza, who's like Glauci, who's the new fiance. We have Creon, who retains his old name. And then finally, we have the Quilombo, which is an autonomous community of runaway slaves that doesn't represent a character in Medea, but it represents the maroon communities that were quite often resistance against the Portuguese. Okay, so the plot is very similar to the original, right? Jasau, in this case, is a slave trader. He falls in love with Jinga while in Africa, and she helps him steal, capture blacks to enslave. So that's kind of the metaphorical golden fleece. In addition, Jinga murders her family, and when she comes to Brazil, she adopts the name Medea. So she lives here on an isolated island because no one is accepting of her, despite the fact that she has two kids with Jasau and she converts to Catholicism. They don't accept her. They still see her as a barbarian, a sorceress, due to her race as well as her religious practices. So after they have two kids, these kids don't look anything like her, so she continues to lose a lot of her identity. Jason Jasau gets engaged to Creon's daughter, Cruza, because he is kind of a ladder climber, a social climber. So Medea chooses to drown her children and kills Cruza with a poison necklace after Creon forces her to leave the island because she's no longer married to Jasau. And then finally, Medea joins runaway slaves in the jungle called the Quilombo. She assumes her old name, Jinga, and she kind of reclaims her blackness, which is pretty powerful for her to finally embrace her own culture by the end. And one thing that's really significant is that Brazil was actually the largest importer of African slaves, more than the US, for the 300 years that slavery was in place. So it really shows us how crucial this play is for helping us understand the plight that a lot of Black descendants living in Brazil have to go through even today. So let's talk about some themes. So one of our biggest themes is dominator versus dominated. What does this mean? So Medea goes from being in power. She begins this play as the dominator because she's a queen, she's an African queen, she's well respected, she has a lot of power within her tribe and society. But then she goes to being dominated by the Portuguese because by the end, she associates with the runaway slaves who are the dominated by the Portuguese. So it's a clear difference between her starting and end position. In addition, we have another theme, which is local versus strange. So think about that for a second. Medea, despite marrying Gisao, right, she's married to a white Portuguese settler. She's viewed as a strange, evil sorceress. She has kids with him. She converted to Catholicism, but she's still viewed as a evil sorceress. In addition, the local village is where Jasao's new Catholic wedding is held. This is contrasted with the African spirituality of the strange forest. So local is kind of the village, strange is Medea's island she's forced to isolate on, as well as the community of runaway slaves. So at the end, while she does get to reclaim her identity, it's still in isolation, which is a really powerful point, which shows us that in this time, even today, though blacks within Brazilian society can still reclaim their power and enjoy their cultural traditions, it's still hidden and it's not something that's fully accepted into by others, especially within white Brazilians. And our last theme is barbarian versus civilized. So, in this time and today as well, Portuguese culture was viewed with a certain eliteness compared to African spirituality and traditions, which were not given the same respect. And this is clearly shown in the play, where Medea's traditions, especially of like paganism and other religious practices, are not treated the same. So, Medea, right, despite assimilating, is still viewed as barbarian. She's not accepted by her people, white people, and she has to associate with the slaves at the end to reclaim her identity. Compared to the civilized Jasau, Crusa, Creon, and others, she is viewed as barbarian. Okay, so let's also talk about reception. How did Olavo want this to play out, and what were some of the striking messages he really wanted viewers to think about? A big one is space and place. This is something he highlights through the use of geography, physical space. Jinga is from the barbaric Africa, making her a foreigner and isolated. She converts to the Catholic Church, but she's not accepted. So that's an example of how racial hierarchy divides her, not physically, but physically. Olavo also uses the island to communicate isolation, right? Because she's by definition on an island, which means she's surrounded by water and she doesn't have access to the land, which shows how she's isolated from the white community for her race, for her religious practices. And finally, the jungle where the slaves live represents maroon communities, which is a powerful statement because these maroon communities often were highly civilized and had lots of government, lots of traditions and structures that allowed these black slaves to sort of reclaim their power and enjoy space for their own cultural traditions. But the truth is, in this play, the maroon community is still isolated and hidden from the main tribe, right? They can't be themselves out in the open, so they have to do it hidden. So, another point of reception is probably the main one, is race, right? So, Olavo, by darkening Medea to make her a black queen, really tries to convey the myths of racial democracy, an idea that despite that Brazil was totally like racially equal, right? People thought it was because intermarriage was common, unlike the United States, and there were no explicit laws discriminating against blacks in the 1960s. But it's a myth because they were still treated much differently and had definitely very unique struggles that Olavo tried to capture within this play. So, again, despite bearing Jason's children, Medea is still feared and hated for her sorcery, which is never fully explained, as well as her race and being foreign, despite being a queen in her homeland. And finally, identity. Medea's religion is also scorned, such as her African practices of conjuring and pagan practices. She's also devoid of identity twice, first when she leaves Africa, and second when she has to be kicked out of the island. And she reclaims it in the end by joining the runaway slaves. But throughout the play, blacks see her as a traitor, whites see her as a foreigner and barbarian, so she has no identity and she does not fit in anywhere. By the end, by reclaiming power, Jinga ruptures ties with Jasau when she kills their children and joins the slaves. In addition, the Quilombo, representing maroon communities, shows us resisting power because they resisted traditionally against the Portuguese, and by doing so, Jinga reclaims her blackness and power. And in the end, Medea remains on the margins, but affirming her blackness. So, in summary, this play really aimed to understand how black Afro Brazilians were marginalized within Brazil and aimed to showcase power structures that are still continued today.